away. Mr. Johnson stirred and groaned. What? What's going on? Look, I've got a stinking headache and I don't have to leave for another hour. Leave me alone, I'm going back to sleep. But the Viking wasn't having any of this. Mr. Ellis had told him to collect the bed linen from room 9, and that's exactly what he was going to do. Sigurd pulled out Nosepicker and pointed it at Mr. Johnson. I clean beetroots, he hissed. All right, go and clean beetroots if you have to, but leave me alone. Mr. Johnson sighed and turned over with a large groan. Sigurd stared down at the poor guest. He pushed Nosepicker back into his scabbard and gritted his teeth. He reached down and grabbed all 4 corners of the bottom sheet. With one almighty heave, he hoisted all of the bedding, duvet and all, onto his shoulders, with Mr. Johnson trapped inside and struggling to free himself. Hey, what's going on? Put me down, you oaf. I tidy, shouted Ziggy, stomping triumphantly downstairs. You're not tidy, you're filthy, came a muffled voice from inside the duvet. Now let me out. Help. Mrs. Ellis was the first to hear the cries coming from the back of the hotel, and she hurried round to see what was going on. She was greeted by the sight of Sigurd striding into the laundry with a huge sack on his back. It was wriggling and shouting and had arms and legs popping out in all directions. Ziggy, what's going on? The Viking grinned. I clean beetroot, this room 9. So saying, he let the bundle fall to the floor. Ouch! Mr. Johnson struggled from the sheets, and after falling down 3 times because his feet were caught up, he finally stood in front of Ziggy, red-faced and fuming. You idiot, he yelled. You numbskull, pea-brain, noodle buns. Ziggy stepped backwards as Mr. Johnson marched towards him. I've never been in such a hotel. Mrs. Ellis hastily tried to calm things down. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Johnson. Sigurd doesn't quite understand the rules of the hotel yet, she said apologetically. Come with me, and I shall make sure we give you a big discount on your bill. As she took Mr. Johnson gently by the arm and led him away, she glared back at Sigurd. You wait there and don't move. As soon as Mrs. Ellis had finished with Mr. Johnson, she went off to find her husband. There was more serious talking to be done. I just can't cope with it all, Keith. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life giving our guests discount because of that totally dopey Viking. Mr. Ellis gave his wife a comforting hug. Don't worry, I think I've come up with a pretty good plan. Penny Ellis glanced at her husband. You know how I've always complained about fetching and carrying guests to and from the station? Well, I thought I might teach Sigurd how to drive. Then he can do it all for us. Are you sure, Keith? I mean, Ziggy could Ziggy cope? Of course, no problem. He'll love it. He'll take to it like a duck to water. I just hope you're right, murmured Mrs. Ellis, already foreseeing disaster. Ziggy's first lesson was in the hotel car park. Mr. Ellis had taken the precaution of making sure there were no other cars parked there. Ziggy sat in the front seat, looking terribly proud. He was quietly making brum brum noises into his beard and grinning madly at Mrs. Tibblethwaite, who was standing by the back door watching. Think of it like a boat, suggested Mr. Ellis helpfully. Like steering wheel controls the rudder. This steering wheel controls like the rudder. Sigurd appeared mystified. No oars, no sail, no boat, no float. Mr. Ellis wiped his forehead. No. Well, perhaps not, he said, beginning to wonder if teaching Sigurd to drive had been such a good idea after all. He took a deep breath. Listen, this wheel here makes the car go where you want it to, understand? Okie dokie, boss, grinned Sigurd. Now turn the key and start up the engine. Mr. Ellis pointed to the ignition switch. Sigurd gave the key a twist and the engine burst into life. So did Ziggy. He shouted with delight and clapped his hands, bouncing up and down in the seat and going brum brum all over again. Mr. Ellis tried to ignore him. This is the handbrake. Take it off like this. Put your foot on the clutch and push it down. That's right. Now we put the gear lever into first gear. See that other pedal? That's the accelerator pedal. Push it down gently and take your foot off the clutch and wah-hey, whoa-wah! Suddenly they were off. In a giant series of leaps and bounds, the car began to spring across the car park. Stones spurted from the wheels and shot out behind, showering Mrs. Tibblethwaite. Mr. Ellis hastily grabbed the steering wheel and tried to give the car some sense of direction. At last the car stalled and came to an abrupt halt. Sigurd threw open his door and leapt out into the car park, where he began a madcap dance of triumph. Even Mrs. Tibblethwaite joined in. While Mr. Ellis sat in the car, breathing heavily and saying a few prayers of thanksgiving for a safe delivery. All at once, Ziggy was back in the driving seat. "Again," said the Viking. "I go faster." "Steady on," said Mr. Ellis. "Don't get too excited. Right, start up again, and this time we'll go for second gear." "Second fear," shouted Ziggy incorrectly. "You said it," muttered Mr. Ellis, as the engine came to life, and the little car began bucking around and round the car park. "Put the clutch in," yelled Mr. Ellis above the roar of the overworked engine. "Now put the lever into second gear." "Second fear," cried Ziggy again, as the speed of the car increased by about 20 miles an hour. "Slow down, Ziggy. Take your foot off the gas. Slow down. Watch the corners. Change gear. Slow down. Turn left. No right. Left. Change gear. Steer. Watch that." Mr. Ellis' voice trailed away to a helpless whimper as the car went charging round and round in circles that were getting wider and wider and faster and faster. "Brum, brum, brum," yelled Ziggy, grinning madly. Mr. Ellis put his hands over his eyes. Never had second fear seemed so real. It was at this point that Ziggy grew tired of going round and round in circles and yanked the steering wheel in the opposite direction. The turn was so sharp that the car almost turned right over. Mr. Ellis was hurled against the side door, and when he next looked straight ahead, he was alarmed to see that they were now heading for the hotel garden. There was a sickening crunch as the car bounced up the curb, and then they were on the grass. Mr. Ellis made a last attempt to grab the steering wheel and save them both, but it was too late. "Brum, brum, brum," cried Sigurd once more, as a final burst of speed, the car shot across the lawn and did a nosedive into the hotel pond. "Water," announced Ziggy. "Splish splash. I get out now." He climbed from his seat out into the pond and struggled to the shore. The car sank a bit deeper. Mr. Ellis pulled himself from the passenger seat and followed the Viking back to the hotel. Sigurd looked back at the sinking car with great disappointment. "That car no good," he said, shaking his head. "It no float. Bad car. I go clean beetroots for Mrs. Ellis." Mr. Ellis watched him squelch into the hotel with a look of despair. He knew that Mr. Thrip would soon be back, but for now he didn't have the energy to do anything about it. And that is the end of our 3 chapters for today. I shall be back next week with 3 more, where we'll get up to some more adventures with Siggy and those other characters at the Viking Hotel. Bye.